On May 10, 1940, the Nieuw Amsterdam was sailing on a cruise off the coast of Venezuela. War raged in Europe, and while the Netherlands remained neutral, it was far too dangerous for their prize liner to remain in European waters. The Nieuw Amsterdam was to remain in the relative safety of New York Harbor and offer cruises in the Caribbean and South America. But that all changed when the liner received a frantic message from the Holland America Line headquarters ordering the ship to end her cruise early and return immediately. The Nieuw Amsterdam raced back to New York Harbor, zigzagging to avoid German U-boats. The mood on board drifted from shock to fear and anger as they slowly learned what was happening at home. Without a formal declaration of war, the German military invaded the Netherlands and quickly overtook the small country. The Dutch government was forced to flee across the English Channel to London, and Queen Wilhelmina narrowly escaped the country in the dead of night. The Netherlands, which had managed to stay neutral during World War I, was now under Nazi control, and the Nieuw Amsterdam, the nation's flagship, built to be a ship of peace, was now a prime wartime target. On November 23, 1890, King William III of the Netherlands died. The Dutch crown passed to his only surviving child, 10-year-old Wilhelmina. The Netherlands was a relative latecomer to the Industrial Revolution, but Queen Wilhelmina proved to be a shrewd businesswoman. She used her vast inheritance to make a series of investments in the United States. These investments proved wise, and Queen Wilhelmina amassed a massive fortune, becoming the first female billionaire in dollars. She would use this fortune to invest in Dutch industry in the 1920s and 1930s. Her funding helped the Netherlands emerge as an industrial powerhouse, and this industrial growth fueled innovation in Dutch shipping. The Holland America Line was founded in 1873. Based in Rotterdam, the company proved popular, carrying over 400,000 to the Americas in their first 25 years of service. The line's passenger fleet consisted of several, relatively modest but well-appointed ships. By the mid-1930s, there was optimism that the Great Depression was easing, and the company began planning a running mate to the popular 29,000-ton SS Statendam, which, like most Holland America Line ships, was built at the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast, Ireland. The same shipyard that built nearly all of White Star Line's ships, including the RMS Titanic. Ever heard of it? It's relatively obscure. Ships of state were all the rage at that time, and it was decided that the new liner should represent the best of the Netherlands, including the country's growing industrial might. The new 36,000-ton liner would be constructed by the Rotterdam Dry Dock Company for 13.5 million guilders, or $950,000 US. Funding was provided by the Dutch government, and the project was considered a necessary morale boost and economic boon for the nation. Her keel was laid down on January 3, 1936, and designated yard number 200. Originally, she was to be named Prinsendam, but after more consideration, Holland America Line decided a better name would be the Nieuw Amsterdam, after the 17th century Dutch colony that was seized by the British in 1665, and renamed New York, where I live. On April 10, 1936, the new liner was launched into the River Maas. She was christened by Queen Wilhelmina, and the event was watched by thousands of enthusiastic Dutch spectators. She gave a toast to the new ship, and the Dutch Minister of Economic Affairs, Henri Gillissen, replied, "God grant that this first happy launching of the flagship of the Dutch Merchant Navy may be a good omen, signaling a prosperous journey into the future. May the Nieuw Amsterdam carry the Dutch tricolor wide and long across the seas for the glory and benefit of our beloved country." The new ship was dubbed a ship of peace by the press because, unlike other ships of state at the time, the Nieuw Amsterdam was not designed with any wartime uses in mind. The Nieuw Amsterdam was designed for both transatlantic crossings and pleasure cruises. While other nations competed for speed and size records, the Holland America Line instead focused on design and comfort. They set out to build a ship that would beautifully represent the Dutch people through art, engineering, and service. When she was completed, she was 36,287,000 gross registered tons, the largest liner ever constructed by the Netherlands at that point. She was 758 feet long with a beam of 88 feet. She was powered by 6 Yarrow boilers that fed dual reduction geared steam turbines to produce 34,000 shaft horsepower. She had a service speed of 20.5 knots, and she could carry 1,220 passengers across 3 classes along with 700 crew members. Several leading Dutch architects contributed to her interiors. Her public spaces were decorated with a restrained Art Deco style. Their designs were straightforward and placed comfort and livability over dazzle and drama. Art pieces were used intentionally, not to draw attention, but instead to add a tasteful accent to the spaces. These tasteful styles and high-quality materials were carried from first class into cabin class and even into third. This continuity between classes allowed the liner to more easily convert to a single-class cruise configuration. It also made her more appealing to tourists, who appreciated quality accommodations even if they weren't luxurious. Creating less difference and distinction between classes was a strategy that also proved deeply successful on Cunard's Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth. First class was obviously the most luxurious on all these ships, but third class definitely did not feel like the steerage found on pre-war liners. The Nieuw Amsterdam was also equipped with amenities like air conditioning and a high percentage of en-suite bathrooms. She was also only the second liner to feature a full theater, the first being the Normandy. The care and details devoted to her interior spaces made the Nieuw Amsterdam deeply popular with passengers, who appreciated her tasteful designs. She more than held up her builders' intention to represent their nation in the best possible light, and she was quickly dubbed the darling of the Dutch.
The winter of 1939 and 40 was described by amateur statesmen and strategists as the period of the phony war. Cruise ships were sunk in the Battle of the Atlantic, but there were no land battles.
The Nieuw Amsterdam left Rotterdam for her maiden voyage on May 10, 1938. The voyage took 5 days, 23 hours, and 45 minutes. She arrived in New York to great fanfare. The press showered her with praise, remarking on her bright, streamlined appearance, steady handling even in rough seas, and beautiful, light-filled interiors. Over the next several months, she continued delighting passengers and smoothly transitioned to cruising at the end of the 1938 season. But as tensions in Europe mounted in 1939, culminating with the Nazi invasion of Poland on September 1st, the Nieuw Amsterdam's transatlantic voyages became crowded with European refugees fleeing for the relative safety of New York. As the war in the Atlantic began, after only 17.5 transatlantic voyages, the Dutch government and the Holland America Line decided that it would be safer to temporarily stop offering transatlantic voyages. The Dutch flagship was laid up at Hoboken in New York Harbor. The Netherlands remained neutral as the period known as the Phony War dragged on, and the Holland America Line decided that it would begin offering cruises between New York and southern tropical destinations. The words Nieuw Amsterdam Holland were painted in bold white letters across her hull to deter any misidentification by Allied or German warships. These cruises continued into 1940, but by spring they became less popular. Then, on May 10, 1940, the crew of the Nieuw Amsterdam got the news they dreaded. Without a formal declaration of war, the German armed forces invaded the Netherlands. The small country was taken by surprise as the Nazis quickly overwhelmed them. The Dutch government fled across the English Channel, and Queen Wilhelmina narrowly escaped in the night. The liner was ordered to immediately return to New York Harbor. Tensions were high on board as they realized they were now a target of war. But the real shock, horror, and fear set in as they learned what was happening at home. Staff Captain Rens Bronson later wrote, "All I could think about was my wife Margaretha and our 2 daughters back home in Rotterdam, now living under the control of the German jackboot. From this point on, I did not hear from them for 5 years. I did not know if they were alive or not, and they had no knowledge of me." On September 12, 1940, the Nieuw Amsterdam was officially seized by the Dutch government in exile and transferred to the British Ministry of War Transport. The ship was placed under Cunard White Star management, though she kept a Dutch crew and continued flying the Dutch flag. She arrived in Singapore on November 9, 1940, where she would be converted to a troop ship capable of carrying up to 6,800. After her conversions, she mostly stayed in the Indian and Pacific Ocean until 1944. She carried troops from throughout the Allied nations, especially India, New Zealand, Australia, and the United States, as well as occasional prisoners of war. Conditions on board were cramped and uncomfortable, but reports suggest that the general mood was fairly positive despite the wartime tension, with many deck games, concerts, and other impromptu festivities. By 1944, the Nieuw Amsterdam returned to the North Atlantic, transporting troops to the European theater, and she played a part in the preparations for D-Day. She would continue transporting troops in the Atlantic throughout the end of the war. In April 1946, she was finally returned to full Dutch control. Her funnels were painted back to the Holland America Line colors, and on April 9, 1946, she set sail from Southampton to her home port of Rotterdam. Her return to her bombed-out home port was a moment of huge celebration for the nation. Nearly every small craft still capable of floating greeted her, and spectators lined the shore, waving the Dutch tricolor flag and shouting, "The darling of the Dutch." The Nieuw Amsterdam was in rough shape, covered with rust and damage from years of wartime service. She transported 378,361 troops and traveled 530,452 nautical miles. She proved to be a valuable asset to the Allied war effort. Now she was finally ready to resume her intended peacetime service. After returning to Rotterdam, the Nieuw Amsterdam was quickly transferred to the Rotterdam Dry Dock Company to begin conversions back to a luxury passenger liner. Nearly every surface and piece of furniture had to be restored or replaced. All her rubber flooring was beyond repair, as well as 85% of her carpeting. Nearly all of her walls also had to be replaced because of the thousands of initials and messages carved into them by troops. All 374 of her private bathrooms had to be renovated, and she was rewired with over 300 miles of new electric cables. 12,000 square feet of her glazing also had to be reinstalled after being painted over to keep light from giving away the ship's position, and nearly all of her handrails also had to be refinished due to carvings. In short, the ship was essentially rebuilt from her keel up. The refit was made even more difficult by post-war labor and material shortages and ended up costing more than the ship's original construction costs. After 18 months, the Nieuw Amsterdam was finally ready to resume passenger service on October 29, 1947. The liner was immediately popular and quickly gained a reputation as a favorite among the rich and famous. She carried stars like Rita Hayworth, Jane Russell, Katharine Hepburn, Cary Grant, and Spencer Tracy. In 1956, the Nieuw Amsterdam underwent an extensive refit to keep her up to date. New air conditioning systems were installed, and she was fitted with a new stabilizer system. Her first and tourist class cabins were also updated, and most visibly, she adopted a new paint scheme. Her original black hull was painted a lighter gray. The new, brighter livery was adopted to help her keep cool in tropical climates and suited the liner beautifully. She remained hugely popular throughout the 1950s. On September 3, 1959, she was joined by the stylish and ultra-modern SS Rotterdam. The brand new ship had little impact on the Nieuw Amsterdam's loyal following, and the aging liner remained deeply popular. She underwent several further refits throughout the 1960s to keep her updated. But as the decade wore on, she began to show her age. In April 1967, she experienced a major boiler failure that nearly took her out of service permanently. But the Holland America Line was committed to keeping the beloved 30-year-old liner running. After an extensive search for the necessary parts, she was finally repaired and returned to service later that year. But time was not on her side, and as the 1960s drew to a close, the Nieuw Amsterdam's contemporaries were all withdrawn from service one by one. And you know the story by now. By the 1970s, air travel was the preferred way to cross the Atlantic. The Nieuw Amsterdam maintained strong passenger numbers for most of her career, but in her final crossings, she carried more crew than passengers. By 1971, the decision was made to finally end these unprofitable crossings and devote the ship to full-time cruising between Port Everglades, Florida, and the Caribbean. She was better suited than many historic liners for the tropical climates, and this new purpose showed some promise. But the 1973 oil crisis made the aging and inefficient liner impossible to keep in service. The Holland America Line looked for alternatives, including turning the beloved liner into a hotel. But their disastrous financial position left them with little option but to sell the liner for scrap. The Nieuw Amsterdam sailed her final passenger voyage on December 7, 1973. Many loyal passengers got to experience her one last time. She then made the sad final voyage to Taiwan and arrived at her final berth on May 2, 1974, where she shut off her engines for the final time and was cut apart over the next several months. By that October, the liner was gone. The Nieuw Amsterdam is one of my favorite ocean liners. In a period of fierce nationalism and one-upsmanship, the Holland America Line didn't set out to break any records with her size or speed. They simply put everything into creating a ship that people would love. Every aspect of her design was devoted to passenger comfort, and their attention paid off. She was one of the only liners to make a profit in the 1930s and continued her profitability well into the 1960s, even as ocean travel was on the decline. She had a loyal following for a reason. Like the Queen Mary for Great Britain, the Nieuw Amsterdam perfectly represented the best of the Dutch people. She may not have been the largest or the fastest, but she was just really good. And sometimes, that's all you need. Alright everyone, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed and that you'll take a second to get all over that like button and maybe subscribe if you haven't already. And until the next one, be nice to people. See ya.